Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Pereira. I'm from Let's Media, and we are here again to discuss about digital identity. This is a new episode for Let's ID, and we are very proud to be sponsored by Soluti, which provides digital identity solutions in Brazil. If you need anything related to infrastructure, like certificates or anything else regarding digital identity, you definitely should look around Soluti. They are very specialists on this. And we are really proud to be sponsored by them to bring really interested people in the industry and have them speaking with us, sharing industry insights and the future of a digital identity as well. So today, so you say that I'm speaking in English because it's a very special episode. We are receiving here Gail Rhodes. She's executive director at the OpenID Foundation. So the second person from OpenID Foundation that we receive here on the show. And also she's a senior advisor to the state of California. And she has an incredible career in this industry. Also had work at Apple and different places. But I'm gonna let her to introduce herself and also start with this question: how digital identity became part of your career, and to be honest, I think part of your life because I think this is uh, takes very much hours of your day of your life. So I'd like to thank you for being here and very welcome, Gail. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Wonderful to be on the show and be part of this conversation. So you're quite right. I'm very obsessed with digital identity, and I suspect many of your listeners are leaning in that direction. Some of them might have started because they were asked to get involved with digital identity, and some might have gotten drawn into it because it's such a fascinating domain space. So for me, most of my background was in financial services, about 20 years in working for places like American Express and HSBC, and then Apple, working on Apple Pay. And it was really when I was at Apple around 2016 that I put up my hand and said I'd really like to get involved in digital identity and what it can mean for Apple Wallet. And so I was leading that exploration and what was turning into our product and our roadmap strategy for what is now ID and wallet and some other functionality, like how Apple devices can read chips on passports and national IDs. So it was a really kind of exciting time to be working at Apple on that topic. But it was something that even before that, when I was at HSBC and banking, I could appreciate the importance of identity and what was likely to be that next wave of transformation. And it's clearly taken some time to get to where we are today. But we seem to be at that tipping point with tens of countries working on digital identity implementations. 1.5 billion people are probably holding digital identity credentials, including many of your Brazilian listeners. I suspect have a digital credential in their device. And so it's a really exciting time to see what this technology can enable for people around the world. And I'm excited to try and do my bit with the different hats I'm wearing to take the conversation forward and help the other 6.5 billion people get access to digital identity credentials and to really level up digital identity infrastructure for the global community.
That's amazing. Um, Actually, that you mentioned like you want like everyone to reach the digital identity, and it's interesting because during this season we discuss this on the podcast with people like everyone is from Brazil, and they were talking that we have a kind of tipping point here in Brazil. That was the pandemic, because we have more and more people use our online service, and we have a kind of a boom on this industry here. But it come from a market that maybe they were digitalized before us. So I would
Mm-hmm.
like to understand, like 2016, how was this discussion about digital identity, or maybe before than that, how was digital identity on that time? If you had, I don't know, the idea that become what became right now, and
Yeah,
I'd like to understand this scenario because it's totally different from Brazil for sure.
yeah, yeah. There's so many different starting points, I guess. around that time, 2015, 2016, I was actually traveling back and forth to Brazil a lot because I was launching Apple Pay in Brazil.
Amazing.
And working with some of the banks and acquirers in the market and trying to figure out how to drive NFC adoption. And actually, it was during the COVID crisis that we saw NFC growth, I think, in Brazil, as well as in the US, reached pretty broad coverage. And so, in fact, it was trying to avoid touch-related transactions and keep things at arm's distance and kind of pushed along NFC. But in 2016, the first kind of thoughts when I was talking to countries, talking to different people all around the world, was trying to get the kind of baseline of where things were, right? There was a lot of chip-based cards that were out there, a lot of plastic cards in jurisdictions like Australia or Canada or the US, but in many other jurisdictions, national IDs that were chip-based. Passports were moving towards being chip-based. There are about 1 billion passports at that time that had chips, around 4 billion national IDs had chips, but it was not very evenly distributed. So there was the concept of more digitized related credentials, but those digital credentials weren't that consistently used in everyday life, right? It was very tricky to try and present one of those digital passports for an online transaction, right? It became slightly easier when you could use your Google Android device or your Apple device to be able to read a chip, but that was still pretty future looking. So you have these chip-based credentials, but they were by and large just being used for crossing a border, right? When there was a particular terminal that you could use for that. So the landscape at that time, it was very separate, the physical credential world from the digital credential world online, right? You're using your logins and your passwords to get into different sites or to get into government services. Maybe a particular government has given you a special online code to get into something, or maybe if you're a really high-ranking official, you've got some sort of smart key that you're using or a second factor of authentication. But it was really pretty fragmented in two kind of separate worlds between the physical identity credential issuers and online digital identity infrastructure providers. And it was kind of following the paths of innovation on the internet, right? When you're talking about online, and following the paths of physical credentials going from paper to plastic to chip, but they hadn't really kind of come together in any cohesive way. And I think that's what we're starting to see happen now as more and more services are digitized, as governments are trying to transform their digital services and be more relevant to their citizens. We're seeing this kind of merger of those different areas, but it's still in its infancy. I equate it to being like the era before there were mobile phones or the era before there was the internet. Something really meaningful is coming, and the people listening to your podcast are probably aware of the potential. Maybe in Brazil specifically are experiencing it more on a day-to-day basis, but most people in the world don't really know what it would be like to have more robust digital identity infrastructure that could substantively improve digital trust amongst your community, both in person and online, right? Where you have less risk of fraud, you have more confidence that the counterparty who they say they are is indeed who they are. So it's something which I think we're just getting the feeling of what is possible.
I think this digital trust is really the key. And I heard a few cases during the season about people that basically go into bankruptcy because of fraud. And for an entrepreneur, this is a really, really sad situation because I'm doing the fundamentals of the business. I'm creating value to the customer. But at the end of the day, it was fraud that created the end of my business. So because
and that's awful, right? That an innovator, right? That's someone who's really trying to improve their lot, to be creative, to create value, and make stuff happen, that they could, have everything that they've built up be taken away from them by a bad actor, right? That's very painful for an individual, but it's also tax on society as a whole, right? When you have someone who's basically just able to come over to your house and rob you, right? It's the digital equivalent of that.
And the thing is that this robber right now, they have a really, they can scale. So they are shifting the crime to the online scene. And
Yeah, that's
so
right. And they're very successful,
yeah,
right?
in
The
Brazil.
most successful businesses in the world in identity are the criminals. They have a $6 trillion business right now, defrauding people and businesses. Right? They make much more money than any individual company does.
Oh my God, 6 street of that's. I didn't
Right?
imagine this. How was stress? Because you said you were in the launch of like Apple Wallet in Brazil. So how was this stress on that time? Like because in Brazil we have more fraud, and I think this is the challenge, and also I think that's why we are really good on preventing fraud. I think it's they raise the bar here, we try to raise again, and this never ends. And how was that time? I would like to have a landscape. What were the fears on that time? What were the tools that I have available? For example, stuff that you didn't have on that time, and they were developed during the next years.
So I think what was so the Brazilian market, as I understood it then, and clearly things could have moved on a fair bit, was quite sophisticated in terms of like technology and capabilities. There's a decent amount of concentration amongst the banks, a handful of major banks and key acquirers, and a lot of very sophisticated digital merchants online. Very different to, let's say, a US market with 10,000 banks, right? I mean, it's not quite as concentrated in the same way as you would have in Brazil. And there's also a lot of distribution in the US market across different layers, and there's more consolidation with the acquirers in the Brazilian market. So the challenge was, what would be the tipping point, the relevance for those key stakeholders that are already present in the market to benefit from new technologies, right? Why digital payments? And this is kind of, I think there's probably an insight for digital identity in there, but the key challenge, one of the key issues was the acquiring experience. When you're going up to that terminal, that CLO terminal, what is the kind of screens that the user is going through to present an NFC transaction and to do a contactless payment? And when we first engaged in the market, or when I was wearing Apple hat at that time, the journeys were a little bit different between Hedgie and CLO and Santander. And so they didn't have a consistent experience. And that was going to be a barrier to entry for the user who wouldn't know what they needed to do when they walked up to different terminals and were like, I want to pay with my mobile device. So one of the things to kind of crack the code there was to make sure that there was a common user experience across the terminals for that NFC transaction. And that did require some changes by the acquirers to get to that more kind of common, consistent journey, so that things could take off. And that would work for both the physical card as well as for the mobile device transactions. But I think the insight there was that it was critical to the user experience and the behavior change that was going to be necessary to make it easy, right? You needed it to be a very straightforward, simple experience, both for the staff who's taking that transaction, as well as for the individual who wants to present their device, right? And so that particular piece of the puzzle, I think, is the same for digital identity,
And we
right? If you
are
wanted,
this challenge that I mentioned. We are facing
yeah,
this with Pix right now because
yeah,
we are discussing Pix with NFC, and we have a few solutions that are taking place right now. But we have a tremendous success with Pix in Brazil, but not in the POS, in the point of sale. So the
mm,
user experience, it's really a key for the success of any kind of payment.
yes, yes, that's true. So I think what it takes to kind of motivate the key stakeholders to be interested in changing those user experiences to enable the behaviors that are going to help drive the adoption is part of the recipe of how deep you need to go to actually change an entire system, right? So in that case, it was like making a transition from traditional magnetic stripe and chip and pin cards to like contactless transactions. That was one of the things that needed to be tackled and overcome. So it was possible to cross the chasm and scale a different kind of technology. So those learnings will be true for digital identity as well. right? So when you need to present a digital version of an identity credential at a physical terminal to say, yes, I'm of an age where I can purchase this, or yes, I am the same person who's trying to withdraw the cash, is trying to like assert my identity to the bank, the bank official. Whenever you have that instance where you need to assert your identity, it's got to be seamless at the point of sale. And the people who are at the point of sale don't want some new bit of equipment that's just for a specific purpose. They want it to be integrated with how the rest of their infrastructure is working in their shop or their retail or their bank branch, et cetera. And then online, similar thing, right? Where am I putting that in my checkout, in my experience, my user journey? Where does this fit in? How does it become a part of a seamless experience for my user that makes it less friction, lower cost, and easy, for me to integrate from a developer perspective, but also is going to have real impact on my top line and my bottom line.
And when in your career, because most part of the companies, if it always they're thinking about their business, right? And when in your career, when you're discussing about digital identity, opportunity for your business, bringing more customers online and everything, giving more trust, when you start to think about digital identity in a more broader way, like an infrastructure, not only for your business, but for the society, when you say, hey, I can't create a solution only for myself here, because this is everyone problem. If I don't solve for everyone, I'm not solving for anyone. I think this is like a challenge that any company had, and sometimes they have right now.
Yeah. It's there. It's a tough question you're asking, Gabrielle, because for me, there's a constant calibration between like the vision of where technology and the market is going and like how to work through this complex ecosystem to get stuff done. And what does that mean for the next specific thing I need to do that day, right? What is the next thing that my team might need to work on? What's the next thing that, the community is tackling, so there's like this blocking and tackling at a very minute level. And then there's this much bigger picture of like where to head. And to kind of say where from a digital identity perspective did that kind of start to sink in for me, I could say one way of looking at it was when I was at HSBC, and I could see how NFC and chip-based transactions and the role that mobile devices were playing. At that point, there were mobile network operators trying to disrupt the payments domain space, and there was a lot of risk and threat associated with how they might try and intervene and basically extract value from the financial services industry. And there are a few specific examples, like M-Pesa in Kenya, where they had successfully achieved that. And it was like, okay, is that going to scale, right? That was one of the concerns at the time. And they've been less successful. But the next wave that came along was the digital platforms, right? That's where there was the newer type of threat, the PayPal threat. What would Alipay be doing? What would Apple and Google be doing? Were they going to be the next wave of disintermediation and threat that could erode the customer relationship, erode the value that traditional players are trying to protect, right? And trying to grow. And so I think back at that time when I was learning about those chip-based technologies and what they were capable of doing and what mobile devices were capable of doing, to me, it was a mental jump to say, the identity credential is going to do the same thing. And if a bank, for example, is completely based on trust of connecting merchants and individuals, then having a digital version of a credential on a mobile device is going to be really very disruptive. And so even before I had joined Apple, I was already kind of seeing, what the art of the possible would be. But in a company like Apple and like many others, it's what is the shorter term roadmap, right? What needs to happen this quarter, this next year, or in Apple's term, often kind of 3 to 4 years out. That's still kind of a relatively short time frame compared to like seismic change of digital identity infrastructure, which is going to be longer. And classically, there's a lot of fear of government and the speed with which they're able to innovate, right? I think it was probably the last use case for Apple Wallets and Google Wallets to move into identity, right? whole bunch of use cases first. There's payments, there's coupons, there's travel, boarding passes, like all sorts of things came before identity.
Yeah.
And even now we see their kind of identity capabilities just in a couple specific jurisdictions, but not really widespread, globally available, because it's really tough to do this across jurisdictions. Standards are not there. Things are coming. We can talk about standards.
Yeah.
But it was like a bit premature. So I think that is where I saw the opportunity, both the challenge, but also the excitement of knowing that it's inevitable. It's like a manifest destiny that there needs to be digital identity infrastructure. And then the question is only how you get there.
Because I imagine that, I don't know, if it was a company or also like a government, anything, I would ask myself, hey, this is really important, and this has a network effect. So if someone does this first, it's really difficult to, I don't know, to change it, to overcome and everything. And when do you think people start to look this and maybe say, hey, now we have to do this digital identity public infrastructure, maybe have to look this more carefully because this is gonna, I don't know, drive more benefits for the society. Maybe this is gonna have us more clients using our channels, because maybe all of these discussions, they become before the standards, because it was the need. When people, they figure out about the need and said, hey, let's discuss this to do this like a public infrastructure.
Yeah, that's it's a really important question, because the need, like what drives the first, the decision by the government official, the decision by the private entity to pursue the task, there can be very different motivations, right? So there can be the motivation, like let's say in Brazil, the central bank, senior leadership is saying, okay, we want to have PIX, we want to, combine faster payments with digital identity capabilities, with digital transformation. And at the same time, we want federal government together with the states in Brazil to have a more cohesive way of delivering services to Brazilians, right? And so there was a leadership goal maybe on what government, the vision is for what government needs to deliver, and then the kind of technical insights on how to architect that in a way that it can be then delivered, right? To execute. And it's pretty effective, right? It's one of the golden examples, I think, compared to maybe Aadhaar. I think India and Brazil are two of the leading examples of very rapid adoption of digital public infrastructure across multiple different categories being connected together. And other jurisdictions are following a similar recipe and seeking to do the same thing with open source code, which we can talk about. But that's like one kind of government, almost kind of like top-down approach to the problem solving. And then in other jurisdictions, it can be private sector led, right? You look at it in Australia or in the UK, the government is more kind of arm's distance, and like digital identity is being led more by the private sector. So you have four kind of axes. You've got government led versus private sector led of digital identity innovation. And then you also have more centralized models where it's top down or more government, driven centralized models versus more decentralized models. There was a paper that 13 nonprofits, including the OpenID Foundation, wrote, kind of explaining, those dynamics and, the background for how you get to that point. But the motivations to be on different points of the curve it's that government leader who's trying to drive a particular objective, or it's the private sector. Maybe it's the banking community that's creating a private sector service and they want to try and monetize the knowledge that they have about their users. Or it can be, a completely new startup that happens to develop the right relationships with government or with other players, and they're able to kind of monetize that relationship. So it can start from different places. If you look at each individual ecosystem, it's like, what is the champion use case that drives the first wave? And often digital identity is not unto itself the first thing. It can often be, you need healthcare, and so then digital identity comes. Or you want financial services, and then digital identity comes along the way. Only in more the exception, or maybe in emerging markets, you might say, oh, we need to do civil registry infrastructure, and I'm going to put in place and modernize my civil registry capabilities, And then I'm going to bolt on top of that this lovely little digital functionality, for our users to be able to present a credential. So, it has very different starting points, but as a collective, like for 8 billion people, you want to get to a place where those services end up being interoperable with each other, because people and businesses cross borders.
Yeah.
So we need to allow for that, and also to avoid the lock-in that can come if you don't have a standards-based approach to those jurisdiction-specific implementations.
And when you have this different starts, when was this moment that people said, hey, as you mentioned, we need standards, and we have to discuss this because we're going to have way more benefits if we go deep on this and find the best standards, where to start. Because when I imagine that, I like the open finance example, because everyone is doing in their countries, and I think it's kind of the same way. It could be like private led, or more like this public enforcement, like the central bank and everything. And they're trying to see, I don't know, we're not so strong when we talk about like global standards, but we're taking a lot of reference. So we are looking at a lot of things that were being done in UK, and take a lot of examples from them.
Yeah.
So when this happened for identity, because it's pretty much with the born of OpenID Foundation as well, I would like to understand this part of the story as well.
So it's kind of like a different approach in other jurisdictions. So in Brazil, for sure, open finance seems to have been, conceived at the same time as PIX and at the same time as digital identity credentials. Like, it was all connected in a larger strategy that the central bank and the gov.br group, were driving, in that coordinated fashion. But open banking and open finance in other jurisdictions was more like a siloed pursuit, right? So in the UK, under what was the entity? I'm blanking, but the open banking implementation entity, like, ultimately took over.
It was
control.
the OBA.
So OBIE is the entity that's overseeing it, but it's the competition authority.
CMA.
Right, thank you. Yes, so the CMA, and then there was what they called the CMA 9, or the top 9 banks. And so there was a mandate to allow for open banking, to allow people to be able to assert they'd like their banking transaction data or payments to be authorized outside of one of their first 9 banks to fintechs, right? To make it easier to offer fintech services, or to move your bank account from one place to the other, and improve kind of competition. And that all was kind of spawned out of GDPR, and this concept that consumers own their data, not the company owning their data. That was a big seismic shift, right? And there were some precursors to that, some work in Europe, which has played out slightly differently with the Berlin Group, and in India, they have their own way that they were approaching the same type of concept, and in Singapore, same thing. But there was almost like a domino approach, right? After some of those initial precursors, the UK took more of a standards-based approach built on OpenID Connect called FAPI, and then Brazil did the same thing, used FAPI as a standard. And now we have about 12, 14 different countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Australia, both the US and Canada. We refer to FAPI as a best practice. So there's like all these different countries that are starting to follow a standards-based approach to enabling open banking and open data, so that consumers can authorize the release of that data from that home data holder to any other relying party, often a fintech, often in Brazil, it's another bank, right? Allowing banks like Nubank to thrive and to scale very, very quickly. So the more agile institutions are able to take advantage of that regulatory environment, that competitive environment, to offer new products and services. And that concept of consumer data rights is expanding into other verticals. It can also be like open insurance in Brazil. There's also the intent for utilities and other verticals to be enabled in Australia. And in Norway, FAPI is being used to share medical records across jurisdictions. So movement of data between different places I'd characterize as more like dominoes. It started in one place, standards, had some time to mature, multiple jurisdictions feeding back on the standards, and now they're quite mature, going from FAPI 1, soon FAPI 2 will move to final, lots of rigorous security analysis. There's really a robust playbook so that tens of other countries have the opportunity to follow the same playbook if they'd like to. And then that could make it easier for there to be interoperability of open data across borders as well. With digital identity, it's been going in multiple different directions at the same time, right? So the approach in Brazil is not the same as in India. They're both more centralized, but they're not the same, right? They're not using a standards-based, we can't interoperate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
In the Singapore, with SingPass, that's not interoperable by default with Brazil or India. The same for the EU with their architectural reference framework. They are actually selecting a lot of standards. So they're on a trajectory where they'll be able to interoperate with a California or with an Australia. But that still has to be kind of proven out and enabled, that the connectivity and interoperability would work. But all of that is different yet again to, let's say, MOSIP, which is working to 25 to 35 different countries to scale open source infrastructure, similar to ADHAR, but not exactly the same, and to offer open source software to individual countries, and they then have that infrastructure locally. It can enable interoperability, but again, has to be proven out, has to work in practice. So it's not quite the dominoes approach. It's more like fireworks are going off everywhere. And there's an opportunity to kind of help guide people onto a common path to create the capability for interoperability and help people lean in together.
I think this is really difficult because how it makes someone to be aware that they have like an opportunity ahead in the future if they, I don't know, if they become concerned with something that is broader than what he's doing right now. Because, for example, I don't need to have interoperability with India. I'm in Brazil. Why I'm gonna need this in the future? So it's a kind of, what's the size of your ambition? Because the future, we're going to do this more and more. So, but I have to convince them to do a great foundation because this is gonna leverage its business and everything. So how you manage to evangelize everyone?
So I think part of the learning that I see, it depends on the jurisdiction, right? In some jurisdictions like Europe, they're from the get-go, they're looking at standards, a standards-based approach, because they are in a way going top down and they need interoperability across all the different states. They need each of the different European countries to have a standards-based approach so they can get to the point of interoperability. So it's kind of like a global approach in the context of a particular region. So they are definitely going all in on standards, including using OpenID Foundation standards. OpenID for verifiable credentials is core to their architecture. California is absolutely leaning in with what the US model is of mobile driving licenses and offering those credentials to allow for interoperability across states for many Americans. The majority of citizens hold driving licenses or an ID equivalent of a driving license. And so that's a natural first place to start. And the champion use case happens to be like TSA travel. But within the US, California is also experimenting with verifiable presentation and interoperability with mobile driving licenses with Europe or with verifiable credentials with Europe. They're on a trajectory to converge, and they're interested in testing interoperability and are in discussions, with each other, which is exciting.
Right now we have a kind of informal interoperability in US, because when I'm going to rent a car, they say, just show me your drive license from Brazil. They look, say, okay, that's perfect. You can drive right now. But definitely, this is like, you have a lot of flaws.
Yes. I mean, there are standards, ISO standards that sit behind that hopeful ease of travel. But they're basically taking on a risk, right? Like they're agreeing they'll take on a risk that if something that looks a lot like a legitimate Brazilian credential, that it's probably a Brazilian credential, and what's the risk to them, right? The cost of a car, the liability, associated, but that they can size that, right? So they're taking a business decision on how they manage that. But it's a different thing to, let's say, get into the country, right? Is your driving license legitimate enough to get into the country? Nope, you still need the passport. But what about when you go out and get a drink? Can you show your Brazilian license to a bar and they'll agree to give you a beer? Well, maybe not, right? It might not be good enough if that individual, the bartender, doesn't trust it. So that's completely subjective up to a bartender, whether they'd accept a Brazilian driving license or they'd be like, no, go back. I don't trust that. I need to see a passport.
Actually, in Brazil, when you go, for example, to Argentina, you can use your Brazilian ID, but you can't use your driver's license. So, okay, I'm accepting this because I'm prepared to check and everything, but the driver license is not accepted.
Yeah. So I think this is the key point, right? So there will definitely be residents of a given jurisdiction who will never leave their home jurisdiction, and they may never have a digital transaction with somebody in another jurisdiction. But a large number of residents, those who physically travel and those who don't, will find themselves in positions where they're interacting with somebody in another jurisdiction, right? And so that can be that you're going somewhere and you need to get a beer, right? Or you need to assert your identity to get go to a pharmacy or whatever the case is. But it can also be you're pushing code as part of a global entity, and there's a need to be assured that that particular Brazilian employee is who they say they are, right? Both as like setting up for their employment in the first place, and then later that particular engineer pushed that particular code and push that particular code to that AI algorithm, and that AI algorithm is controlling 4 other functions, right? Yeah. So it's this chain of linking the carbon human, wherever they are in the world, to the digital transaction that they're trying to authorize, right? And that can be physical movement of goods, like in the physical supply chain of boats and trains and all that stuff. And it can be the digital movement of goods, like the supply chain of code. And it can also be, you're picking up the phone or picking up the video, and you're trying to make sure that the people on the other side of your video call are actually who they say they are. And it's not, it's cousin Larry, and I desperately need to have 10,000 reais because I'm stuck and my car crashed and I need the money, right? Because it's going to be progressively easy. It's not that many deep fakes now that are causing trouble, but the prospect is dear that it'll become easier and easier to perpetrate those kinds of sophisticated frauds.
Can you tell me more about the OpenID Foundation? And I think this importance of these global standards, and I think I like also this business perspective, because most part of our audience, they're implementing digital ID solutions in their companies. We have also people that they created new areas just to discuss about digital identity in their own companies. And I think we have a lot of things that we can learn with this global standards and use in our daily basis when we're creating solutions for our customers.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm relatively new to the world of standards, right? Only when I started in 2021 with the OpenID Foundation was I kind of deep dive into the standards world. I had helped Apple get involved with the ISO 18013-5 mobile driving license standards, but that was the engineers who were involved in it kind of day to day, less so myself on the kind of business development side. So I've learned a great deal around the standards domain and the role it plays in identity. I think we're all aware of the role of standards in other parts of life, right? We kind of take it for granted that in those physical supply chains, if you've got like the box on the back of a truck, it's the same boxes that go on a ship, or the same size boxes that go on a train. And that is like the movement of goods that allows, global trade to thrive. But somewhere along the way, somebody had to say, this is how wide a train track is. This is the dimensions of a shipping container. And that has allowed global trade to thrive. And so in a very similar sense, digital identity infrastructure is the same as those railway tracks. What's the dimensions you need to have for the railway tracks? What's the size of the shipping container? And what's the data that needs to go inside of that shipping container? So when you have a Brazilian identity credential or a Brazilian driving license, when you go to Argentina, they know how to consume that and whether that credential can be accepted for whatever that particular use case is, right? So we're literally unblocking global trade, and we're improving quality of life, like global domestic, global happiness, by taking friction out of everyday transactions. And that could be 1 million people are able to get a job 1 week faster, right? That can be very meaningful to help people be part of the formal economy and get their paycheck that little bit sooner, because they're able to go from, establishing their identity as, pick it can be someone domestic who's 18 years old and they turn 18 and now they're eligible to get a commercial driving license or whatever the case is, right? They're able to more swiftly take part in the formal economy. Or it could be that it's a high income worker who's come from another jurisdiction into Sao Paulo, but they're able to get their paperwork faster, get their CPF that little bit faster so that they can, hit their desk and start working more quickly. So that can be a highly paid worker, not just the immigrant who crosses a border who needs, asylum, and then they also have the potential to participate in the formal economy if their right to work can be accelerated. And so it doesn't change the legal right. The technology itself doesn't change any of those legal rights, but it can remove the friction, the speed with which people can take part in the formal economy. And it can also just make it easier to go about your day-to-day work and your day-to-day lives.
And how, I don't know, I was wondering, for example, if you have any kind of framework or just a way to how you will approach when you're creating new standards. I don't know, because I'm developing new stuff here. What would be a good way so I can create something that could become a standard in the future? I don't know. What is the good practice?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because there's really a lack of global diversity and the voices taking part in standards development right now. And personally, I have a frame that I see things. So this may not be all of the kind of leading standards bodies, but I see kind of 5 key standards bodies very involved in digital identity right now. It's the OpenID Foundation, it's FIDO for the authorization, ISO for the mobile driving licenses and the digitization of passports and national ID. So ISO 18013-5-7, working groups 4, working groups 10. The W3C, which has some work groups and community groups working on the online presentation, so the presentation of credentials and the verifiable credential 1.1 specification, and the IETF that has some of the underlying OAuth 2.0 capabilities, which is kind of foundational for other parts of the OpenID Foundation standards. So those 5 groups, there tends to be a lot of the same technical experts that kind of work across those different groups to try and mature the standards that are starting to form global, whether they'll all be adopted is another question, right? Like they're starting to drive the core of that digital identity infrastructure. And all 5 of them, in my personal opinion, do not have as much diversity and geographic, context, maybe requirements that would fully represent the Brazilian market, for example, or fully represent the African markets or other parts of Latin America or other parts of Asia, right? It tends to skew towards certain categories like chip manufacturers of yesteryear and browser providers and digital platforms and some financial institutions and some government representatives, but it's not evenly represented, shall we say. And part of that is contextual, right? So if you're gov.br and it's not currently using some of those standards that I mentioned, right, using a different approach, then it may not be critical path for someone in Brazil. It might be interesting, but is it critical, for the development of one's business to comment on those global standards? So it does kind of, depend on whether there's a demand locally, but it's one of the things which I and other SDO, thought leaders are really trying to work on, how do we allow someone like yourself from Brazil or your community from Brazil to be on equal footing with somebody from Apple or Google who have a lovely, travel stipend to help them fly to 6 different countries around the world to take part in standards discussions, right? How do we have that representation from other voices with other requirements to more fully represent the global needs and not just an assumption around what the needs are from those other jurisdictions?
That's a really good point, because if you have like a standard that are just serving a part of the globe, it's not pursuing the ultimate goal. So if you want to achieve like everyone in the world, you need this diversity, like it's a mandatory, I think.
Yeah.
And
And
I was,
I think
yeah,
no, I was just going to say, I think it's part of the recipe for security as well, right? So if, let's say, 80 countries come up with 80 different technical architectures, completely different from each other, then each of those 80 architectures has to have their own security model end to end for all of the participants in the ecosystem. And any entity, like a bank or a digital platform who's trying to trade across those countries, has 80 different integrations that they need to do, right? And so what does that mean? That means some number of the 80 countries will be left behind because it's not cost effective to offer services in that jurisdiction. So, say PayPal is like, oh, we can serve 20, but we can't do 80, right? Or Apple says I can do the top 20 because I make enough money there, but I can't do this other 60. I can't do the full reach because it's too costly and too complex. It also means each of those jurisdictions have to have world-class security professionals building out their architecture, monitoring and maintaining it, because the criminals are going to look for wherever the pots of money are. Yeah. And they'll go after the big markets, but they'll also go after the smaller markets that are weak and don't have the. So all ships rise if you have the secure architecture, which is being maintained and upgraded over time with what we call lots of eyes looking at it, so that it's robust, you can mature it, and everyone's focusing on maintaining those best practice approaches, which allow for the interoperability, which allow for that more secure capability, instead of what we have now, which is a very porous attack surface where the bad guys make out better than some of the good guys do.
If I think in the opposite side,
yep,
wouldn't it make it easier to do a huge damage if I don't know, we have one, like on this hypothetical situation, we have one pattern, and they were like using a flaw and leverage this as a crime to, I don't know, for a huge amount of money that we can imagine. Because in Brazil, this is a good example regarding the wallets and everything. I don't know how, but people just breaking the Face ID and everything on the cell phones. So right now, when people take one phone, they can like overcome, I don't know, 4 or 5 banks that you had there, because one credential was broken and they have access to everything. So how do you tackle this? Because it's all of the eggs in the same basket, right?
Yeah, that's a fair counterpoint. Like, what do you do? And it probably depends on where is the point of attack at each link across the chain. So with it from a standards perspective, when we talk about kind of like that train track, right? How you're saying, here's the specifications of the train track and securing the pipe that's connecting the different entities. That part of it, we believe it's possible to make that pretty darn sophisticated and rigorous, the end-to-end security of that pipe. And part of that is because we're thinking about all of the configuration choices and narrowing it down to a set of choices, which is, the smartest possible best practice we can offer. So in open banking, open data, we call it FAPI, right? What is that communications protocol and the high security profile to be able to do that? And then not only what is that best practice, but what's the configuration advice within that adoption of that? And we've done mathematical security analysis of the FAPI profile in order to mathematically model that there aren't attack vectors around it. So we're really trying to put the very best approach. And then, of course, even within that, if a flaw is detected, like some edge case emerges because an upgrade in MTLS creates like these knock-on, consequences, then there's that ability to identify it sometimes as an academic risk before it becomes a real risk. And so you can put in place the negative tests or update the specification to mitigate it proactively. And you can also, if something emerges, you can try and then also communicate that to the other players. It reminds me a little bit of what Visa and MasterCard would do. If you see a SIM swap threat coming out in Brazil, which I remember happening when I was at HSBC, you're like, I see that threat over there. Now I know what to do to mitigate against that threat in all of the other jurisdictions before it cascades to those other markets. And so there are sometimes benefits to it, but you're right. Like a bad actor is going to be like, oh, if I can exploit that here, let me turn around and tell a ton of other people or sell somebody the secret for how you do that on the dark web. Mm-hmm. And so they're very efficient at sharing information and scaling attacks, which does require a great deal of vigilance. But the pipe, I'd say, is a little bit different to all of the other bits of recipe you need around the proofing side, the provisioning side of transactions, and then the presentation side. There are many other parts of the recipe where you kind of have to look at each one to say, is there a risk of centralization or of standardization, or can that be mitigated?
You mentioned a few names that they are known from our community who works in open finance, like FAPI, FIDO. Actually, FIDO is definitely a part of this PIX by NFC right now. I would like to understand more your point of view of this intersection of digital ID, of the standards, and also the open data ecosystem in general.
Mm-hmm. So I'll try. So they're all kind of interconnected. The link between kind of digital identity and open finance, from my point of view, is that you have the option, but maybe not the obligation, to use a digital identity credential to access your data that you might then decide you want to share, to another counterparty. So it's just a mechanism for being able to assert your identity and give consent for information to be, an action to be changed. So anything could sit on the back of that. It could be a cryptocurrency, transaction. It could be an AI transaction, a supply chain transaction, or an open finance transaction. Yes, I would like my data to be shared from Banco do Brazil to Nubank, right? So that is just the one part that can go at the front of a transaction. With something like, FIDO authenticators, that can be tacked on the front of or part of a digital identity transaction. So if you have an Apple device or you have an Android device with a Face ID or a Touch ID fingerprint biometric functionality, then you could be unlocking your device as part of the binding to that device before you're then accessing your digital identity credential and giving the consent. And then maybe you have another biometric check using FIDO before it's released. But they're complementary to an overall architecture.
I would like to discuss about diversity in the beginning and how maybe this is underrepresented around the world. I would like to understand what communities or out countries, what regions you think they need to be more represented, and what's going on to tackle this challenge as well. I'd like to discuss a little bit more about this because Brazil, we are receiving a lot of events here right now. People are discussing not only for public infrastructure, but also in the private sector as well. And this is global, it's happening everywhere. What's going on and where we should focus right now?
Lots of opportunities, right? It's going to be another 10 plus years of exciting times and roller coasters and a lot of movement. So I'll riff on a few different observations that I'm seeing. And I'm really interested in learning more about the Latin American dynamics by ideally attending Clareciev next year and kind of getting to know more of the requirements and stakeholders there. But just kind of looking back at the last couple of years of going to ID for Africa events, which tends to convene a large number, 30 plus different African countries, and the digital identity experts from the government, as well as vendors and so forth. There's a lot of interest in Pan-Africa trade, Africa for Africa trade, and of course continuing to grow African trade with the rest of the world, and to support social inclusion goals, and there's refugee-related goals. There's a huge mandate and set of objectives they have for themselves. Within the context of a project called City Hub, which is looking at cross-border interoperability, the African Union's goals around being able to enable interoperability of identity credentials across different jurisdictions is of great interest. And many of the African officials that I've had a chance to meet have said, cross-border trade is really important to them, and that many people live on the borders between countries. And it might be a river, for example, that defines the border between a jurisdiction, and there could be families on either side of that border and communities split across those border, and traditional trade that would happen across that border very organically. And then in comes, mobile networks or banking infrastructure, which then suddenly silos those communities from each other. So they can't go about their everyday behaviors the way that they have for millennia before the digitization of those services. And so they have this challenge with cross-border trade, not in it's the shipping containers of stuff going here and there. It's more so around their residents living their everyday lives and having their everyday lives be obstructed because they don't have the social inclusion across a jurisdiction where they used to be able to freely operate. And there might be similar challenges in Latin America. And I've heard an indication that may be true, but I'm looking forward to learning whether that is indeed a problem. Because it would seem, by looking at a map, that might be true, that many rural communities located on those borders would have the same issues. And that might not be what the cities are experiencing as the big problem, or what they would require as digital identity improvements. So I think that's one area of interest in terms of geography and inclusion and identity requirements, is not leaving any one of the 8 billion people behind, right? Not leaving any country or continent behind, but making sure that this is digital identity infrastructure that is truly bringing along everyone along the way. I think I heard that Brazil and Uruguay are working on some cross-border interoperability of digital identity. I haven't heard anything other than a headline, but that was encouraging, right? To see that there are those first steps of working on, some of those cross-border requirements, and I'd love to learn more about that. Same is true for many countries around the world where they have, Malaysia, for example, was one of the first countries under UNHCR's refugee program to have QR codes printed on a bit of paper so that those refugees could assert their identity to police to say, yes, I am a refugee, I have a legitimate right to retain, but I can just use this bit of paper for you to check that my QR code is legitimate and linked to a UN database that says, yes, this is the picture of me and I'm allowed to be here. So you can't effectively persecute me on the street or arrest me, as not being a legitimate resident. I can assert that right.
And we are heading to the end here.
Yeah.
And I would like to understand, from your point of view, for people that, I don't know, I can see your passion regarding this mission, because it's not an industry. What I'm saying is that's really a passion for you, and how people that, I don't know, they are falling in love with digital identity right now, how they, what is your advice for these people that want to follow this path as a career, to pursue this goal? I don't know, maybe they can find a job, or no, they can create open source code, make contribution to discussions, and maybe this can lead, I don't know, to a different path. What are the ways that people can build on this mission as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So if for those that are, already technologists, maybe more experienced in their career, particularly interested in standards and some of the things we were talking about, then obviously the OpenID Foundation, openid.net, You can kind of hit the website up, or you can email director@oidf.org, which is me, Gail Hodges, and ask. Right. So it's a group of 400 some organizations and several hundred kind of passionate volunteers who contribute their time to create the protocols, and it's a learned art. Right. It takes dedication and focus. But it is something which one can, focus on and learn and develop up the learning curve. So there's obviously the OpenID Foundation itself, and you can contribute with no cost or anything. Those who choose to be a member can be an individual member for $50, and corporate members, starts to step up. Nonprofits and governments are very low cost, $250. There's another organization, a peer group called ID Pro. That helps with certification. So if you're, a budding identity professional and you'd like to be able to assert your credentials and your knowledge, there's a great body of knowledge that ID Pro maintains for people who are looking for roles in the identity community. And they also have a certification program, for participation. For those that are earlier on in their careers, there's also an organization called DIAF, which accepts applications for people to fly to events. We've had Brazilian representatives in the past, but to be able to go to some of the industry leading events like Identiverse and EIC or IIW, and be able to kind of, frankly, just have the airfare. Right? If you're young in your career, you might not have the resources to take part in some of these global forums. So those are a few. And then I mentioned City Hub, which is this cross-border interoperability challenge. Also happy to have volunteer participants. City, SIDI-community.hub. It's city, it's SIDI-hub .community is the destination. You can get some website information. We have work streams working on challenges there too.
And because you mentioned places that people that have experience already have experience. And when people want, I don't know, I'm liking this, I'm enjoying this, but I'm not feeling so confident to contribute. I want to learn first. It's the same places, you have different views. I don't know how they can learn as well.
So a lot of those same resources, like at the OpenID Foundation, we have a white paper section, for, what are the background papers on open banking and open data, some background papers on digital identity, human-centric digital identity, and then certainly the body of knowledge at ID Pro is another fantastic resource. It's one of those things where you just kind of have to jump in, right? If you have the inclination, then it's just kind of getting started and trying to feel comfortable that even some of the brightest people, the most tenured with decades of experience, nobody knows everything. So it's absolutely okay not to know everything and just to make your way up the learning curve on the areas that are of interest to you. And then, of course, to start trying things, right? So if you happen to be, in a role, working on something, you might be able to say, oh, can I figure out how to consume that driving license, that mobile driving license, right? How could I use this Brazilian credential? Or I hear about this Uruguay relationship. Oh, my business has trade with Uruguay, right? What can you do within your day-to-day work to start engaging?
Great. And I also mentioned that, just one last question, like in the next 10 years, you're going to have these Holocausters and a lot of fun and developers opportunities. How do you believe that we're going to be in 10 years? What do you think that we're going to be capable to achieve? Or maybe all of that use case that you mentioned, you're going to be more spread. What are your thoughts?
I love the question. My guess is that within the next 10 years, we'll probably be where we are now with like people without any digital identity credentials at all, right? So there's 8 billion people. There's about 850 million who don't have any digital identity credential. My guess is that we'll move pretty slowly over the next couple of years, but we'll probably start rising up that adoption curve pretty rapidly. Maybe it's AI threats, maybe it's another COVID crisis. I'm not sure what the instigation will be, and it might be different in different places. But I'd like to say that we'd have 7 billion people with digital identity credentials, within 10 years. And then that last billion or two, are still going to be a pretty tough long tail where it's been, tough to invest, tough to make it happen. But I'm optimistic, right, that we're going to take it for granted that we'll look back and say, oh, yeah, we remember when there wasn't the same degree of digital trust. And when the bad guys made the $6 trillion, and then we'll be able to say, oh, it's different, right? We have a different degree of trust in.
They may find another job.
Exactly. I'm happy to be put out of a job.
Would be great. Definitely, I want to, especially open data grow together with this because, as you mentioned in the beginning, like the digital trust, this is like the essence of everything that we do online. If this, like it's overcome challenge, I can imagine how many innovation, everything that it can create because we definitely have this confirmation that we know with who we're talking about. So
Absolutely. And as a mother of 2 young children, I'd like my daughters to be in a safer place when they're, going onto the internet, that it's a safer environment as well. So I think there's a lot of good to fight for, and we need an army, of good guys fighting to make it happen. So I expect there's a huge number of folks in Brazil who can be part of that crowd. And I very much hope they'll continue to do so.
Thank you very much for your time. It was a great conversation. Like I'm really enjoying all this season, getting to know more about digital identity. And one thing is kind of a standard among everyone. It's this passion around the topic. So when I see that you really believe in what's going on, that have this kind of a mission, I don't know. You can't be, I don't know. You can't be kind of agnostic. You feel this, and you want to do, want to be together, want to be part of this. So, thank you very much for your time. It was a great discussion, and I hope we can discuss maybe in the middle of the 7 billions with 3. We can discuss again of what's going on. Would be great.
Anytime. My pleasure, Gabriel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much,
right.
Gail, and also for our audience. Thank you for enjoying this episode. It was really, really great. And I'd like to thank Soluti as well, who's sponsoring this Let's ID program and making possible that we can have all of this conversation with great industry leaders around the world and understand what's to come on digital identity industry. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.